Whether it's the overconsumption of books, lack of critical reading, or the latest BookTok drama, bookish commentators always seem to have something to say, except rather ironically when it comes to books themselves. For me, and perhaps others who have been members of the book community for quite some time, it often leaves a sour taste in my mouth where the BookTube community that I love has been condensed into nothing more than just pretty people reading pretty books in pretty homes with pretty footage giving nothing more than pretty reviews. Now, this might seem harsh, and to a certain extent is actually supposed to be, because if I've learned anything from my time here on YouTube, it's that nothing entices people more than the prospect of drama. This video is not necessarily meant to be a critique of any particular creator, but is more so to be a critique on the trends that are most popular, which in my opinion are bookish commentary video essays and then aesthetic videos such as shorts, vlogs, and even wrap-ups that focus more on the packaged presentation of the video than the actual content that has been discussed. And part of me wonders if this is kind of almost by design. I feel like with video essays there's sort of a lot more of, I don't want to say informal because it is very formal in the discussion that's being talked about, but the sort of presentation skill around it tends to be scaled back a lot more compared to aesthetic videos, which are focused more on the overall presentation of the product than what is actually being discussed within them. This can also apply to books as well. There's, that very classic saying of don't judge a book by its cover, and that does apply a lot when it comes to social media. The way that the algorithms are based is largely around the perceived ability to get people to click on the video, which is largely influenced by how enticing the thumbnail that goes along with that video is. I feel in many ways that this almost punishes people for trying to do something that is outside the box, and I think that goes with both video essays and aesthetic videos. The video essay format is where you sit in front of the camera, it's very static, maybe there's some pictures being shown, maybe there's some cut-ins of different videos or photos that might help to substantiate the argument that the video essayist is making, whereas aesthetic videos are kind of the complete opposite, where typically there is no sense of a static nature to it. It's always constantly showing you new things and trying to entice you based on the visuals that are happening to sort of distract you away from the lack of information that is being shared through that content. Now, that isn't to say that this is always the case. I do think there are probably some instances where aesthetics, especially if you're talking about something like art in particular, can be really beneficial to helping someone to better understand something. I think there's also some critique to be made about video essays where sometimes it might actually be a bit boring to just sit and watch someone talk about something without them actually providing any sort of visual stimuli to keep you interested in what they're saying. And I do think this has a large thing to do with the expansion of short form content in general, which is why I sort of grouped it in with the aesthetic categorization, because short form content is about trying to entice people very, very quickly. And I think there's been a lot of commentary about how the expansion of short form content and the proliferation of this content within our media, specifically on social media, has also dramatically decreased our attention span, which is a very ironic thing almost to be discussing in the context of books, because books are kind of the exact opposite, which is why there's been so much discussion about whether or not critical reading skills are on the decline in today's society, largely because of the way that social media has conditioned us to think about things. Engaging with books and also discussion about books online is an active way of kicking against the attempts at limiting our ability to critically think about things, because to read a book, to talk about it, requires a lot of time. And I actually think that this is a big issue as to why people don't like to produce nuanced commentary in the aesthetic kind of context and also in the video essay kind of context, because nuance requires a lot of time. To be able to present a nuanced commentary, you need to research things from both sides and also be willing to engage with content that disagrees with your own perspective and opinions in a manner that is critical but also being respectful, which is a very difficult thing, I think, for most people to try and understand. I personally think in part this is largely due to the way that we're taught about things in school. I think when we conceptualize the idea of critical thinking, we conceptualize critique as being inherently negative. And I think we see this a lot in the book community as well, specifically with videos that aim at being like a deep dive or deep analysis into a particular book that typically tends to be a very popular book, talked about a lot or hyped up a lot in the more aesthetic and unpacking. You know, a lot of these videos do present very interesting commentary about some of the issues, whether that's about the prevalence of sexism within romantasy books, or trying to investigate whether the hype around the book is more so based on the hype around the author or the hype around the pretty cover rather than the actual content of the book itself. I don't want to come at this and be like, these videos lack depth to them, because I do think they have a lot of depth, but what I do think they lack is an ability to provide an opinion from both sides. And I think that our school system, kind of going back to that original point, conditions us to think this way because the way that we're taught to write essays is that we have to write it arguing for one way. And it actually actively discourages us from thinking about something from the opposing perspective, because thinking about it from the other perspective or from multiple other perspectives typically will actually weaken the overall argument. Now, this isn't always the case. There are some teachers who might prefer for students to provide counter arguments and sort of argue against those counter arguments, but from my experience, this is typically discouraged and can sometimes be very complicated, because if you bring up a counter argument that the marker actually agrees with more than your own argument, you're also taking a risk in losing marks from that as well. Maybe it's just me being like an academic perfectionist, but I feel like this is also something that maybe a lot of people in the book community as well can relate to, because of how associated literacy is with academia. And I also definitely think that there are a lot of content creators who have provided very well researched, very in-depth commentary on a particular book, looking at it from a multitude of different angles, as well as closely examining the text and unpacking things. One of my favorite content creators who does book stuff, his name is Crimson Rogue, and he has done hours-long commentary videos discussing very popular BookTok books. And I think a lot of people see this video and see the fact that it's like 8 hours long and be like, oh my god, this guy is crazy. How could, have so many negative things to say about this one book? And the reality of the situation is that not everything that he is saying is negative. It's just to really unpack the nuance and give a fully in-depth critique and commentary on the book of both what it does well, what it does bad. It takes a very long time. And once again, this whole aspect about social media and short form content is about perception that we have a lack of time and a lack of attention. And so nuanced commentary isn't going to actually do good, because it requires not just more time out of the viewer to watch it, but also a lot more time for the person behind it to research things. And this is something that I've run into a lot with trying to plan out video essays for my own channel, is that I have a lot of things that I want to talk about, but in order to talk about them in the way that I would like to, it requires a lot more research that I just don't have the time to do, and to some extent don't even have the skills to do properly. In some cases, there's also just not a lot of research, and sometimes I don't feel like I'm very qualified to give a definitive overview of this topic that maybe hasn't been commentated on before, because I don't have any of the actual educational or academic experiences to substantiate such an argument. And I've even had people in comments express the same sentiment. I spoke one time in one of my videos about how, from my perspective, I feel like the self-publishing market is sort of being subsumed by the traditional publishing market, largely because we're seeing a lot of self-published books picked up by traditional publishers. From my perspective, I see that a lot of authors today are sort of using self-publishing as a way to jump into traditional publishing, as opposed to actually wanting to do self-publishing as self-publishing. It's just a way to almost bypass the traditional traditional publication process by simply just writing the book and publishing it and hoping that it gets the virality via marketing to be picked up by the traditional publisher, as opposed to having to go through the rather arduous process of querying, getting an agent, getting a publisher, because there are a lot of barriers for entry, whereas contrastingly in self-publishing there isn't. However, when I made this argument, someone in the comments said, "Oh, I was a self-published author, I haven't been seeing this," and that's okay for them to have that opinion, but they asked me for proof, and the reality is that there isn't actual academic research behind things. The only thing that really counts as proof is anecdotal of this book was picked up, this book was picked up, this book was picked up. You can't show that that's a significant portion of the market without knowing how many self-published books are on the market, which would be next to impossible to try and determine. And also, trying to run that experiment in the beginning you would have to find out which kind of limitations do you want to put on things. Are you only studying books in English? Which platforms are you searching for these self-published books, such as Amazon or individual author websites? And trying to perform this large-scale analysis to determine whether or not definitively that self-publishing is being sort of swallowed up by traditional publishing would be next to near impossible to fully provide that scientifically, empirically based evidence, as well as in situations like this where the empirically based evidence to support either that argument or the counter argument would require a full-scale experiment that would be either very difficult or near impossible to do. It begs the question of why does it even matter in the first place? But once again, anecdotal evidence is not going to weigh everyone. And there needs to be this nuance in that conversation, because I do think that this commentator in particular did have a point in saying that, no, from my experience, traditional publishing is not swallowing up self-publishing. Because I don't think that is the case in every single scenario. I think it's more so the case that very popular books in the self-publishing industry are being picked up traditionally. I think overall this kind of does beg us to ask the question of whether or not we can provide nuanced commentary in the first place, or if any and all commentary that we provide is limited by the amount of research that we can do, whether that's because of our own skills at doing research or whether or not that's a limitation posed by the sphere of research that we're seeking to pursue in the first place. And then it also begs the question of how do we start to change these things? How do we get academics to start caring more about the influence of short form content or the connection between self-publishing and traditional publishing? What do we have to do in order to encourage people to actually do that research in the first place? And I think what we have to do is actually talk about it. So it makes it a bit of this chicken eats the egg situation, where the only way that we're going to be able to get nuanced commentary on things is by having unnuanced commentary of people sharing their opinions and arguments that might just be streamlined to present one certain particular view. If we don't talk about these topics, there's no way for researchers to understand that there would be an interest to pursue those things even more. And that can also be said about video essays as well, is that video essays in general I think are inherently reactionary to something, whether that's an event like the latest BookTok drama that I mentioned at the beginning, or phenomenon like discussion around the overconsumption of books, or the decline in critical reading, which can typically be spurred on either by someone making a video essay, an article post, or something of the sort. Sort of like news reporting in a way, where there has to be a topic to discuss to be able to put forth a discussion on that topic of what role should us as people in the book community who are engaging with it in public manners, such as making videos like I'm doing now, or writing comments, or even watching videos, of what is our responsibility and which role do we play? Do we play all of these different roles, such as is our unnuanced commentary on books essential to starting the conversation towards having a nuanced conversation about that book in the first place? And book content creators in particular, I think, have a really significant way of influencing the conversation conversation around books, largely because they're influencers, but I think the main thing is not just the platform that they have, but also the privileges that they have. And I think one of the biggest ones is being able to receive advanced reader copies of books. They allow the influencer not only to read the book, but also promote it prior to its release. Within the sort of world of ARC reading in general, there is sort of this notion of a conflict of interest, because if you're receiving a book for free or possibly from the publisher alongside items, I did a video talking about a PR box that was a scented edition of a book, for example, and part of me wonders if the content creators that received this scented edition of the book were encouraged to promote a more positive attitude towards it than what they actually would have presented if they had encountered this organically. Rather ironic when talking about food. But I do think it calls into attention the influence of capitalism on how we talk about books. And as influencers, we're able to determine what the conversation about a book gets to be before the general public has access to it. Readers who are watching our videos, reading our reviews, are going into that book with a preconceived notion, whether that's a positive or a negative one, that to some extent limits the open-mindedness and nuance that the reader is able to bring to analyzing that work. As the book is marketed so heavily by one of the influencers that they love and enjoy, they might feel pressured to enjoy that book more than they would if that influencer had not marketed it, because they want to connect with that influencer, they want to talk about that book with that influencer, they want to engage with them and engage with the community. In a way, this has created sort of this polarization that I think exists with the book community essays versus the aesthetic videos, because a lot of the books that are promoted in the aesthetic videos are the ones that get critiqued a lot in the book commentary sphere. And so what it kind of resembles is almost a complete divide in which books each sphere and their audiences like to engage with. Typically, what results from this is that books that get popular in the aesthetic sphere, even before they're released, such as through those influencers receiving art copies, will get video essays made about them, then shapes the ideas of the audience of the books from the video essay commentaries. And I think this is sort of just a thing with online discourse in general. The same thing can be said about video games, about movies, about TV shows, where the content that we consume does end up shaping our opinions of the content that original content is about. The same sort of conflict of interest also tends to rear its head when established book community creators also make their transition into the author sphere, as there's already been a lot of discussion about Haley Pham's new book, which I personally don't really watch Haley Pham's content because I just don't read the same books as her, and I don't really have any interest in reading her book. But I have seen a lot of people who have been saying that either the book is going to get, 5 stars from a lot of her friends and fans, or it's going to get a lot of 1 stars from people who don't like her content. And I feel like that really highlights the difference between the aesthetic versus the commentary sphere. I feel like Haley's content really fits into the aesthetic sphere a lot more, and a lot of the books that she tends to like are ones that tend to be criticized a lot in these sort of video essay. It's just very jarring to see, because I feel like the conversation around her book completely lacks nuance, because her popularity within the book sphere makes it so that people aren't able to treat her as a separate identity from her content. It's almost like her book is seen as a continuation of her content. And to some extent, it might sort of be. I haven't read the book, I don't watch her videos. I can't exactly say whether or not that's true, but just the way that I've seen people talking about her, whether that's talking about her in a positive way or a negative way, largely been them expressing their own opinions about her and her content rather than treating her book as a separate product, which is what it should be. And Of course, there is some criticism to be levied against that example of like the death of the author, so to speak. But contrastingly, when we study things like classic literature, for example, we're actually encouraged to take on this death of the author approach, where when studying someone like H.P. Lovecraft, we're encouraged to look beyond his racist past to explore the complexities and depth in his work. The same is true of people like Ernest Hemingway, who I think was pretty well known for abusing his family, and we're taught, his books are revolutionary. The same is also true of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who I think there's been a lot of commentary about him stealing the work of his wife Zelda Fitzgerald. However, contrastingly, there's been very little commentary about Leo Tolstoy having done the same things, despite the fact that his wife, Sophia Tolstoy, has a literal published diary of her life for over 50 years that's like 1,000-page long that unpacks how absolutely horrific he treated her, and also shows the amount of work that she put into doing his books, which scholars have claimed actually is enough work for her to have been considered a co-writer for the books. We're not taught to look at that nuance, and I can't help but think that there is some element of misogyny and privilege being exercised there, whether it's a notion of, the privilege of historical figures or the privilege of men in particular, and this notion that we should respect something because of the significance it has rather than respecting something for its actual integrity. And once again, that might be a bit of a strange comparison to make, but I do think it highlights a sort of similar dichotomy. There's one camp that believes that the author is essential to the work that is being produced, and there's another camp that says that author is not essential to the work that's being produced. I personally sit somewhere in the middle, where I think that the author's background does contextualize the book that you're reading. However, it's the reader's responsibility to unpack that, and if they unpack those things in the correct way, I still think it is possible to enjoy a book that you don't agree with the author on. And I think the first step towards this is actually having an awareness of the issues with an author before engaging with them. And for some people, this might deter them completely from engaging with an author. I definitely have authors that I flat out refuse to read because of things that I've heard about them. And I think that's fine. But that's also my personal decision, and it's not right for me to push that personal decision, that personal viewpoint on someone else and say that just because I don't personally agree with this author and won't be reading their content that you can't, because I think that you are capable of making those same decisions that I have made for myself, for yourself as well. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because what is sort of at the core of this issue and of this sort of dichotomy is an issue of agency. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we face with critical thinking, because critical thinking is about having the agency to think about things freely, to think about things uninfluenced by the opinions of your peers or the laws of your government. While we cannot account for any of these variables, the key behind fostering critical thinking and ability to engage wholeheartedly with books in any media is the capacity to conceptualize ourselves as free individuals who are capable of creating our own opinions that are uninfluenced by those of others. Now, there is no clear-cut way of how to definitively ensure that your opinions are fully your own. What we believe is also going to be influenced a lot by our own cultural backgrounds. I've talked a lot about this when I do reviews, that I will mention my own personal experiences when I think it's relevant. One of those topics is that I have autism, and for me, it contextualizes how I think about a lot of things, because my entire thinking process is a lot different than others. I bring that up a lot in conversation when discussing my opinions about books, because I do sometimes provide an opinion that might be very different from someone else's, because my lived experience is very different based on who I am as a person. My approach to books largely is that it's a conversation. Just as we're having a conversation here now, I think when you're reading a book and trying to engage with it both critically and respectfully, the important thing is that you want to treat it as you would that the author, the characters, everything about it is sitting right in front of you and you're having to talk with it, which from my perspective I think allows a certain level of equality. The author's experience, the character's experience, and your experiences are all sort of laid out on the table and seen as equally important to coming to a decision on what the overall message and meaning of the book is. And this is a very, I think, kind of abstract notion, and one that might be a bit hard for others to conceptualize, because how we're taught about reading is typically in a hierarchical manner. I've sort of provided some criticism of the school system earlier, and I'm going to do so again, because when I really struggled with reading, and I've actually found out recently that I have dyslexia, and I think that was a big part of why I really struggled with reading things aloud, because my form of dyslexia actually makes it very hard for me to decode the sounds that different letters make. My struggle wasn't that I couldn't read them, it was that I couldn't pronounce the words. And so when I was in school, a lot of the reading techniques that we were taught was to read a book aloud with a teacher. And so I would get really, really frustrated trying to read because I understood what the story meant, and I would keep on getting interrupted while I was trying to read the story and engage with the story because I wouldn't be saying the words that make up the story correct. The teacher had a notion that, this is the right way that the words would be said, and I didn't feel like I was being treated equally. And I understand that that was maybe a silly thing that a child would be frustrated about, which honestly is what it was. I was a child and I was frustrated. I think my frustration mainly lied with the fact that they had the right to interrupt me. And they were interrupting me because they were the authority in that circumstance. And I think this is also true when it comes to trying to explore meanings in text as well. There's a lot of times where I was in school and I would try and provide my own thoughts and opinions about a text and then be told by that teacher that I was incorrect just because my opinion was different. And largely, I wasn't given the opportunity to explain why I think differently, why I feel differently, which for me, like I kind of said earlier, is highly contextualized by the fact that I'm autistic. Especially when it comes to books that are very well regarded, whether that's, hyped classics or award-winning books or just books that are very popular. I think people are less willing to engage critically with them because they see the book, the author, or the content creator who recommended it to them as being someone with more authority to determine what is good than they do. Part of being able to foster an ability for critical thinking is being able to unpack and say that no, my opinion is as valuable as this content creator's, as this author's, as this award committee. It doesn't mean that you're dismissing the importance of others' opinions. It just means that you're placing your own at the equal level of them. And I think that's what allows you to engage with things critically, is by placing yourself as an equal participant at the table. It's about making the table sort of a circle where everyone can discuss things properly and on equal footing, rather than sort of a pyramid where, someone is sitting on a throne and the other is sitting on the floor. Now, I think for the most part that brings us to the end of this video. Just kind of had this idea on a whim. As a result, I do feel like maybe some of the things that I talked about I didn't maybe communicate as clearly about, or possibly might have said something that might be rude, and I really didn't have any of those intentions behind doing this video. This is trying to talk about larger trends that I'm seeing as someone who's trying to enter the sphere of sort of the book community at large. Because for me, it's been very daunting trying to navigate this sort of dichotomy between the two types of very popular content, and I don't really feel like I fit in either of those two boxes, and I'm just not really sure about what I'm going to be doing moving forward. For the most part, I'm kind of just doing whatever I want, and I hope that to some degree that you all watching this video do possibly enjoy this as well, because that maybe the way that I talked about things brought to light maybe some issues and different interpretations that you might not have thought of at the beginning. And once again, as always, I'd love to hear what people say. I do try my best to try and respond to comments, but it is very difficult, especially when you're getting a lot of comments. And I've also had some issues in the past where either the comments have been negative and I've had, issues interacting with them, or a lot of the comments tend to repeat the same ideas, and so then it becomes repetitive trying to write complex responses to things. So Any comments are appreciated, but I would appreciate it if people can be nice about things, and that is not just towards me, but also about like any other like theme, trend, or like content creator and whatnot. Like, this video is not supposed to be hate towards anyone, and I will repeat that, and I said it at the beginning and I'll repeat it here. This is just supposed to be a commentary on trends as a whole, so it's more of a commentary on the book community as rather than any specific individual within it. And so if you would like to talk about any specific individuals within the comments, please just be respectful about it, and that also includes being respectful towards me and also other commentators as well, as that's sort of what the intention behind this whole video was supposed to be, is emphasizing the importance of respect and nuance when having conversations with books, and I feel like that should extend to our conversations with anyone else as well. So once again, thank you everyone for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, perhaps consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me to sort of determine what kind of content people want from me moving forward, so I would really appreciate that. And once again, thank you and goodbye.